Each Souls game usually have that one thing that makes your difficulty stand out from the rest. So today I wanted to go over the hardest thing about each of the games. You know, what makes each of them so difficult. Before I get into the first entry, I do want to say that this topic is subjective, so everyone's take is going to be different. Now let's start with Demon Souls. The hardest part of Demon Souls for me is dealing with the tight and narrow pathways. Okay, look, just hear me out. There are other things that makes the game challenging, like how unforgiving it is when it comes down to dying. For example, every time you die, your health caps at 50%. This penalty also affects the world tendency system. Depending on whether you're in black or white tendency, you can be locked out of certain items or events, which adds another layer of difficulty. But for me, the narrow pathways stand out as one of the most frustrating parts of the game, especially if you're using a larger weapon. These tight spaces make combat feel restrictive, and swinging a big weapon can be awkward when walls and obstacles constantly get in your way. What makes it even worse is the enemy placement. There are usually one or two enemies blocking the path, which forces you to take your time and carefully fight each enemy instead of trying to run past them. Which, don't get me wrong, I completely understand, and I'm not even mad at that. If you attempt to run, you'll get blocked by a strong enemy ahead, and at that point you'll be trapped having to fight enemies both in front and behind you. This situation can feel overwhelming, and it really punishes a reckless playstyle. I get that this design encourages you to stay cautious and strategic, but it also feels unnecessarily stressful at times. The combination of tight pathways and tough enemy placement makes progressing through some of the areas a test of patience. Admittedly, this is a bit of a weird pick for what I find the most difficult about the game. Still, the narrow pathways have constantly been one of the most frustrating aspects of the game for me, even more so than the harsh death mechanics or the world tendency system. One of the hardest parts of Dark Souls 1 is the long and punishing runbacks to the bosses. After dying, the game makes you travel through entire sections of levels again before you can retry the boss fight. These runs often involve multiple enemies and traps, forcing you to fight your way through or attempt to sprint past everything. Neither option is ideal, as fighting takes up resources and running risks you getting, caught and killed. What makes this even harder is the level design itself. The environments are filled with ambushes and enemies placed in ways to make it easy to slip up. This can feel draining, especially when you're eager to practice the boss but get stuck repeating the same section over and over again. The game's overall difficulty also plays a role here. Since Dark Souls 1 was many players' introduction to the series, the lack of shortcuts and frequent enemy encounters made these runbacks even more challenging. Unlike later games where bonfires or checkpoints are often placed closer to bosses, Dark Souls 1 makes you work hard just to reach the boss room. This adds to the tension and sense of accomplishment, but can also make the experience feel unnecessarily punishing at times. To make things harder, you might lose your souls during these runs, especially if you die before recovering them. This makes each attempt feel riskier, as you're not trying to just get back to the boss, you're also trying to protect your progress. The pressure of losing valuable souls can make the runback feel even worse. Some examples of bosses with terrible runbacks are Sheath the Scaleless and the Bed of Chaos. Overall, the long runbacks in Dark Souls 1 test your patience as much as your skill. While they help build tension and make victories more satisfying, they also make it super frustrating as well, especially if you're stuck on a particularly tough boss. For many players, this design choice stands out as one of the most unforgiving aspects of the game and adds significantly to its difficulty. The hardest part of Dark Souls 2 is definitely the sheer density of enemies. Unlike other games in the series, Dark Souls 2 often places large groups of enemies together, forcing you to fight multiple at once. This can be overwhelming, as it's hard to focus on dodging or blocking attacks when enemies are attacking from all sides. Some areas like the Iron Passage or Shrine of Amana are infamous for this problem. What makes this even tougher is the game's reliance on mechanics like adaptability. This stat directly affects how quickly you can roll and recover from actions. If you don't level ADP early, your character feels sluggish and your dodges may fail to avoid attacks, leading to more damage taken. This can make combat feel unfair, especially when paired with the high enemy density. The healing system in Dark Souls 2 also adds to the difficulty. Healing in general is way slower compared to other games, and the animations leave you vulnerable for longer. It's like an old man taking his meds. While Life Gems offers a way to heal gradually, they don't restore health quickly enough in dangerous situations. This slower healing system forces you to be extra cautious, as a single mistake can lead you to death before you get a chance to recover. Now, while enemy density is the main issue, the placement of them don't make it any better. Dark Souls 2 loves to surprise players with enemies hiding in corners or ambushing you as you explore. These traps combined with the number of enemies can make it feel like the game is punishing you for moving too quickly. Despite its flaws though, the difficulty in Dark Souls 2 comes from a different angle compared to the other games in the series. It forces you to approach areas more methodically and it prioritizes crowd control over one-on-one combat. However, the enemy density makes it one of the more challenging and at times frustrating entries in the series. For many, this element stands out as the defining difficulty of Dark Souls 2. When thinking about what made Dark Souls 3 hard, I was going over some of the older Souls games and comparing it to them. The level design and enemy placement was a bit forgiving, levels were more linear and straightforward, and the enemy placement isn't as crazy as Dark Souls 2. The combat of the game also felt super polished and more fast paced, so it was easier to get used to. The boss runbacks were also super forgiving as bonfires are just a couple feet away from each other at times. So that led me to the bosses. The bosses in Dark Souls 3 are the game's biggest challenge and what sets it apart from the other early entries. Look, I know that the other games have some crazy next level bosses, and while Dark Souls 3 has some tough ones, they are nowhere as hard as some of the ones in Elden Ring. But why place them here, you might ask? Well, here's the thing. I think Dark Souls 3 is the game that started to put more emphasis on making the bosses harder. Well, technically Bloodborne did, but I felt this more while playing Dark Souls 3. Compared to the previous Souls games at the time except for Bloodborne, the bosses are faster, hit harder, and often have multiple phases, keeping you on your toes throughout the entire fight. This was a crazy shift for those who only played the original Dark Souls games. One of the most challenging aspects of these bosses is their speed. Enemies like Pontiff Sullivan, the Abyss Watchers, and Sister Frida have quick, relentless attack patterns that leave very little room for mistakes. Trust me, this man Pontiff Sullivan to this day gives me PTSD. Dodging requires precise timing, and blocking isn't always an option, as some attacks can easily break through your stamina. The pace of combat feels much more faster compared to the earlier games, which can be a struggle for players used to the slower gameplay of Dark Souls 1 and 2. Another difficulty is the multi-phase nature of many bosses. A boss like the Nameless King starts off with a fight against a Storm Drake before transitioning into a second phase where his moveset completely changes. This keeps you from getting comfortable as you need to learn new attack patterns mid-fight. Gale takes this even further with 3 distinct phases that gets progressively harder. What makes these fights even tougher is the design of the arenas. Many boss rooms are open spaces with limited cover, forcing you to rely entirely on your movement and timing. There's often no way to hide or catch your breath, making every second of the fight intense. To succeed in Dark Souls 3, you need to master its combat system. The game encourages aggressive play, but this comes with risks. You must balance attack and defense carefully, as overextending can easily get you killed. For many players who never played Bloodborne, the bosses in Dark Souls 3 represents the real shift of the difficulty when it comes down to Souls boss fights, testing both skill and endurance. One of the hardest parts of Bloodborne is its healing system. Unlike the Dark Souls games which provides Estus flasks that refills at every checkpoint, Bloodborne uses blood vials. These are a consumable resource, meaning you need to either find them in the world or farm enemies to keep your supply full. If you run out of blood vials, you'll have to grind for more before attempting a tough boss again. This system can feel punishing, especially during challenging fights. Losing repeatedly to a boss doesn't just mean starting over, it often means going back to farm blood vials, which can disrupt the flow of the game. Farming takes time and effort, and it's frustrating when all you want to do is focus on learning the boss's move. The limited healing system makes every mistake in combat feel more costly as each failed attempt drains your resources. The game's aggressive combat also ties into this difficulty. Bloodborne encourages players to be more offensive, using mechanics like the rally system to regain health by attacking right after taking damage. However, this playstyle can lead to overcommitting, which puts you in more danger. The fast-paced enemies and relentless bosses often force you to rely on blood vials to stay alive, making their scarcity even more of a problem. Additionally, some bosses and areas are particularly punishing because of how much damage they deal. Without a full stock of blood vials, it's easy to feel unprepared for tougher challenges. You often find yourself stuck in a cycle of farming and retrying, which can make the game feel more frustrating than rewarding at times. Despite these challenges, the finite healing system is also what makes Bloodborne unique. It adds tension to every fight as you must carefully manage your resources while dealing with the fast-paced combat. Victories feel incredibly rewarding because you're not just overcoming the boss, you're also overcoming the limitation of the healing system itself. However, for a lot of people, this design choice is what makes Bloodborne one of the hardest games in the series, as it punishes mistakes more harshly than most other entries. The hardest part of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is mastering its combat system. Unlike other Souls games, Sekiro doesn't have build variety, summoning, or leveling up stats to make things easier. Instead, the game focuses entirely on skill-based combat, requiring players to learn precise timing, deflecting, and posture-breaking mechanics. For players coming from the Souls series, this can be a tough adjustment. Sekiro discourages passive or defensive playstyles. Instead of dodging or blocking, you need to actively deflect enemy attacks to break their posture. Timing is everything, and even a slight delay can lead to it taking massive damage. This makes every fight feel like a high-stake duel, where even minor mistakes can quickly lead to death. Another challenge is the lack of options for progression. In Souls games, if a boss feels too hard, you can level up, summon help, or explore other areas to get stronger. In Sekiro, you have to face challenges head-on. There's no way to out-level an enemy, you simply need to improve your skills. This can be frustrating for players who are used to having more flexibility. The game's bosses are another major hurdle. Fights like Genichiro Ashina, the Guardian Ape, and Ishin the Sword Saint are infamous for their difficulty. These battles test everything you've learned, often requiring you to master multiple phases and deal with unique mechanics. The boss's relentless attack patterns leave little room for error, and learning their moves can take dozens of attempts, but again, what makes them so hard at first is the combat. Adding to the challenge is the fear of death. Each death not only resets your progress, but also spreads Dragon Rot, which affects NPCs and limits interactions with them. While this mechanic doesn't directly impact gameplay, it adds extra pressure as you don't want to make things worse by dying repeatedly. For many players, Sekiro's difficulty lies in its demand for precision and mastery. There's no way to cheese the system, you have to meet the game on its terms. While this makes victories feel incredibly rewarding, it also makes Sekiro one of the hardest Souls games for new players. Just like Dark Souls 3, the toughest part of Elden Ring is undoubtedly its bosses. With over 150 bosses to encounter, the game offers an overwhelming variety of fights, ranging from optional side bosses to mandatory story ones. Many of these bosses have complex movesets, multiple phases, and high damage output, making them some of the hardest fights in the entire series in my opinion. But what really sets them apart from the other bosses is their sheer aggression. At least in Dark Souls 3, the bosses would have a noticeably long cooldown after a combo, but here in Elden Ring, hell no. The most you'll get is 1 to 2 seconds, and half the time they're at a distance, so you'll most likely miss your chance to get some hits in. Bosses like Malenia, Consort Radahn, Malekith, and the Godskin duo are notorious for their relentless attacks. Malenia in particular has the waterfall dance that can kill you in seconds if you're not prepared. Some of the bosses also have some crazy mechanics, like Malenia again, who self-heals after landing any hit, no matter if you block or not, Consort Radahn, who can insta-kill you if he performs his grab attack twice, and Malekith, where if he lands a hit, not only will you temporarily lose health at a rapid pace, but your health bar will also be capped. It's things like these that really makes him stand out. Another challenge is the open world design. While it gives players freedom to explore and prepare for tough encounters, it also means that the difficulty curve can feel uneven. You might accidentally stumble into a late game area or face a boss that's far above your level. Even with preparation, some bosses feel overwhelming because of their speed and damage. To make matters worse, some bosses are paired together like the Crucible Knights or the Godskin duo. These fights require you to manage multiple enemies at once, which is always a challenge in Souls games. Despite these challenges, Elden Ring also gives players tools to succeed. Spirit summons can make some fights easier. However, even with this option, the bosses remain a major hurdle for most players. The combination of their aggression, complexity, and sheer variety makes Elden Ring boss battles some of the most difficult in the series. For many players, the bosses are what define Elden Ring's difficulty. While they're incredibly challenging, they're also one of the most rewarding parts of the game. Each victory feels hard-earned, and the sense of accomplishment after defeating a tough boss is great. However, there's no denying that Elden Ring's bosses pushes players to their limits, making it one of, if not the most challenging game in the Soulsborne series.